Hey guys, welcome back to Results Junkies podcast. Up on the agenda this week, we're going to talk a little bit about, shockingly enough, AI again. We're talking a little bit about AI and how both Paul and I don't think it's as scary as some people are making it out to be in terms of the loss of jobs. An interesting move by OpenTable, which goes to the heart of just because you have the data, should you really use it? And then if we have time after those topics, we're going to loop back around on our discussion last week about how companies like Microsoft and Google are playing kingmaker in the AI space and talk a little bit more about what the knock-on effects of that are on the startup ecosystem. But before we process all of that, Paul, it sounds like you have a Beacons update.
I don't know if it's an update as much as it's maybe a little outlet to talk about it because I don't get to talk about it very much with anybody else anyway.
Well, you sent a picture, and there's like bars that go up and to the right. So I mean, it's compelling.
Yeah. A couple of years ago, I started experimenting with this idea of what would happen if you started to transcribe every podcast you could find, and then see if what you could do with it. And so fast forward a little bit, I've just been kind of like, it's just been running. I haven't done much with it. It's just been kind of, just imagine a bunch of GPUs just cranking away, crawling the web and all that. Now, where it's at now is that it's just humming along. It's transcribing thousands of podcasts a day.
Mm-hmm.
And a couple weeks ago, I decided to just kind of quietly put it online. And it's not like put it online in the sense of just put it on a website and see what happens. It doesn't have a search interface yet. It doesn't have anything like fancy. But what it's doing is it's transcribing everything. It's then processing those transcripts and looking for entities in them. So,
Mm-hmm.
hey, this company was mentioned, that idea is mentioned, this geography is mentioned. And anyway, it creates pages for those that are SEO'd, like a search engine optimized. And so anyway, it's interesting. Like I haven't tweeted about it. I haven't done anything yet. The website right now has like something like 16 or 17 million pages. And Google's already indexed a couple 100,000 of them. And it's generating thousands of impressions a day now, clicks a day, and all that. And I guess where I'm going with this is that on a personal note, I just think it's really fascinating to see what programmatic SEO. That's kind of called programmatic SEO. So it's kind of interesting to see what happens with that. But one of the other, developments that I've sort of been tinkering with after hours lately has been, I think I told you this, during the tech tour days, Dana and I both became like ham radio nerds. Well, I would say I'm the ham radio nerd because I actually like using it. She's kind of like, she got the license just in case we were in some weird place that didn't have a phone or cell signal, right?
Yeah.
And so here in my garage, I have a bunch of radios running at all times, and I just like to tinker with it with the kids after hours and stuff. Anyway, I started thinking the other day, it was like, well, wait a second, I've got all this gear running anyway. What happens if Beacon doesn't care where the audio comes from. It just sees an audio file and then does what I tell it to do. And so the biggest update now is that in addition to crawling every English speaking podcast it can find, there's a Raspberry Pi with an antenna set up, like a little gumstick computer with an antenna set up in my attic now. And Beacon's also recording all AM and FM radio stations that it can hear here in the DC area. And it's doing the same thing. So, it's interesting. It's interesting because like the amount of data that comes in is insane. But it makes me start to wonder like, hey, next time you go out to Vegas, I should send you out with a gumstick computer and just have you stick it, somewhere over there. Obviously you'd need an uplink somewhere. I should call Matt Paulson in Sioux Falls, who I owe an email to, and he's probably never going to respond to me anyway. But
oh man,
I should probably stick one in his office.
That was on my list too to ask you about. But yeah, go ahead.
Obviously, like my blood-sucking capitalist brain is like, all right, dude, what are we doing with all this code, right? And the answer is I don't know. But one of the things I've been kind of like just kicking around after hours is this idea that like, you know who Nielsen is? Nielsen ratings? Nielsen.
Oh, yeah. I grew up knowing that. Yeah, I had some families that were in our neighborhood that had the dials.
Yeah, so for people who don't know, like, when you think about all those award shows like the Grammys and like, all those awards about, which TV shows did really well on cable or Netflix or whatever, the vast majority of that data is coming from a large company called Nielsen, who for decades now has been paying American consumers to install a little device in exchange for, but basically imagine it this way, like, but way back in the old days, they would pay you a little bit of money or pay for your cable bill. And
Yeah.
in exchange, you would have to put their device, whatever they call their Nielsen device, on your cable line.
Mhm.
And then they would just basically tag what you were watching and then use
Right.
that in the aggregate to figure out which shows were popular and which weren't. And for context, in their public company, right? So in
Yeah.
2023, they did $3.6 billion in revenue. And I don't know what Beacon could be, but what I do know is that when we think about the sheer amount of data that's available on the airwaves right now, I mean, podcasts are great. I love it, right? Now, on an average day, there's only like 7 or 8,000 new podcast episodes in the English speaking language that are released only, you know. But when you think about, like, for example, the DC metro area here, I mean, think about it. There are radio stations that go from, what is it, 87.1 FM all the way to like 108 or 107.9 FM,
Of course you know what that is, Mr. Ham Radio. Of course you know
right?
the entire
Right.
the entire
Well, then you got AM radio as well,
Yep.
right? And so the point is, though, is that there's just, what's fascinating is like, if you just kind of if you just kind of look at the database, you start to see some really interesting patterns of like, oh, look who's advertising all of a sudden. Like you can see patterns that exist or that emerge over a 24-hour period where it's like,
Yeah.
oh, this one company. I say I don't want to name names and give people free press here, but like, for example, when the Super Bowl was happening, you could see which gambling sites were actually paying to be named, to advertise across radio and TV, radio and,
Yeah.
so anyway, blah, blah, blah. The summary is that Beacon's still doing what Beacon does. It's getting traffic, which is kind of fun. And I think, so yeah. And so now it's actually transcribing podcasts, broadcast radio, and TV. So we'll see what happens with that. But I set a little goal for myself where I'm like, okay, well, when I hit a certain number, I'm going to you remember when we were at the Market Beat office and they had those little counters at the front?
Yeah, I love that.
I set a little goal for myself where I'm like, okay, well, if I hit a certain number, I'm going to buy 2 of those things and I'll put them right here behind the camera and we'll just hopefully watch them tick over and over.
Yeah.
I feel like my new goal on a personal note is to become the Indian Matt Paulson.
It gets a little scary.
We'll see if he's still listening to this at this point.
Well, and at least we know, because it was on my list of things to ask you, if you'd actually reached out to Matt Paulson and taken some of his money. So now that we've checked that off the box, let's do a little bit of housekeeping. If you're just tuning in, show@resultsjunkies.com is how you find us. He is at Paul Singh on all those social media channels. I am at Pizza in Motion. And worth a note, I think we'll probably dig in a little bit more on this in the future because I think as time goes by, it's incumbent upon us to make sure that we're reintroducing ourselves to the people that are listening. But Paul's background goes back, gosh, probably almost 20 years with 500 startups at this point.
Well, my investing has, but 500 started, 2010 was
only
500.
14 years. But yeah, investing before that. And I go back to 2007 when I got into investing in startups. Since then we've both had a lot of bridges that we've crossed. You had Bump Boxes, now Strata. I've been a burger guy and a dry cleaning guy, and dry cleaning is much less exciting than burgers.
I thought you guys were out of the dry cleaning now. No,
we are. As I say, I was a dry cleaning guy.
Okay, yeah.
And I hope, and to be clear, hope to never be a dry cleaning guy again. Just for whatever that's worth. It was a chapter in my life that I would like to keep closed.
You won't get that time back.
Yeah, no. All right, so let's talk about
that could have been your cover for the Breaking Bad video, or the Breaking Bad new series that was going to come out. Just Gangster Ed.
Yeah, there you go. Oh my gosh. All right, so I as a bad podcaster, I probably should have uploaded a preview of this tweet. So I'll glue a link to it in the show notes. But for video folks, my apologies for not throwing it up on the screen. This is a really interesting tweet because I think it ties into something I was having a conversation with my daughter about last week. It's from Jason Kent, and it's, newsrooms should be thinking this way for the Google trial. Sorry, he's referencing a tweet that talks about another reporter whose contract is to spend the next 6 weeks covering one of the Trump trials. And he goes on to say, newsrooms should be thinking this way for Google trial starting September 9th, which has enormous consequences. If you can't afford to put a full-time reporter in the courthouse, hire or share one. Ideal candidate knows a bit above, blah, 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 blah. This dovetails into, my daughter came home the other day and she was talking about how her boyfriend's father had mentioned that how AI was going to make a lot of the jobs disappear, and how the things that they were getting ready to go to college for might not exist by the time they graduated. And I mean, I don't want to overly generalize this, but I think like when I look at things like this, I think this dovetails really well back into, my daughter's thinking about going to school for journalism. Journalists aren't going to be extinct in 4 years when she graduates. The trade will be different, and how they do their trade and how they excel at it will be different. But there's always going to be a need for the chronicling of life and stories and technology and all of that. I think it's going to fundamentally change. But I think I think when you said it, like this tweet is a great example of the fact that we are still a living, breathing, growing society.
Yeah. Okay. So two things here. The first is that, and let's just use journalism as the example here. In the pre-show, you were talking about a new service that you signed up for, a new, source of news that you signed up for. And I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but the fact of the matter is that I bet if I looked at all the subscriptions you pay for, I would bet that 95% of the topics that you read about are all covered across those multiple paid accounts. What's different is the viewpoint. So,
100%. Yeah.
right. And so from a journalism standpoint, there's always going to be a need for more and more viewpoints because the fact of the matter is, like, if all news was just reading the facts, then we'd only need one news source. But we all know that the reality is that that you can give 10 different journalists the same fact pattern, and you will likely end up with more than one viewpoint on how that fact pattern is interpreted. So the viewpoint's really the differentiator there. But that leads me to the second point, which I don't know how to articulate very well, but I think a lot of the rhetoric around AI it is sort of blown out of proportion. Like, look, this is kind of like, I'll just use a bad analogy because it's the only one that comes to mind. It's like AI in 2024 is like the printing press of the 1500s. Prior to the 1500s, you had, if you wanted to, copy a bunch of books or mass print a bunch of books, you filled a monastery full of monks and you gave them a bunch of ink and you said, okay, let's go, we're going to copy this 1,000 times. Well, then the printing press came out, and I'm sure if we time traveled back, people would have had the same huffing and puffing. Oh my gosh, what are we going to do? Like the printing press is going to put these monks out of jobs? But that's actually not what it did. It forced them to change careers. I mean, for better or for worse, the history nerds are going to kill me here, but they started making booze instead. And so I think the rhetoric around AI is a little overblown because, like, there's not going to be a scenario where, software takes over everybody's jobs. However, it gives each person a lot more capabilities now that used to only be reserved for massive teams. Like, you and I have been doing work and business long enough to have been on either side of lawsuits for a long time now, I'm sure, right?
Yep.
And you know that, for example, one of the oldest tactics in the book to slow down and a lawsuit and to really blow out the expenses for the other side is to just, when it comes time for discovery, you don't just send the data they want, you send a ton of stuff and make it.
Yep.
Yeah, and then you make the other side sift through it.
Mm-hmm.
And, at $2, $3, $4 an hour for all the paralegals to do this, it adds up, right? Well, like, what did they do 10 years ago when PDF scanners became ubiquitous? People started to just scan it in. They're like, I don't care, send it all. And then between scanners and optical character recognition, you could make the argument that that it put all the paralegals out of work. It didn't. It just required half of them or a quarter of them.
Right.
And so that's kind of where we are with AI right now, is that, like, I think a lot of the people thumping their chests about AI the loudest know the least about it. And the reality is that, when you think about AI, like, it just gives each individual worker, whether you're a developer, an attorney, a journalist, whatever, the ability to sift through much larger amounts of data.
Yeah.
But even going back to that tweet, you still need a human to tie it all together, because at the end of the day, you can't sue the AI if it was wrong. You can't fire the AI if it was wrong. And ultimately, in the context of journalism, it's the ultimate viewpoint that people are subscribing to.
Well,
And
I also think sometimes people subscribe because they want a deep dive on a certain thing that they're passionate about. And I'll use sports as the example. I'm a New York Giants fan, and so I want to know everything I can about my favorite football team. But the problem with today's homogenized approach to media is that everybody sort of has the same story, if you will. So ESPN, Yahoo Sports, CBS Sports, Fox Sports all report 99% of the same story of
Right.
of an event. So have you heard of The Athletic? So like this is a very narrowly focused sports site that ended up getting bought by the New York Times. And so a bunch of reporters who used to be beat reporters for other publications, and when I say beat reporter, like you're on the New York Giants beat or the Yankees beat or whatever, got hired by Athletic to do deep dive stories. And so I subscribe to The Athletic. I used to pay for it on my own. Now it's part of my New York Times subscription. I can go in there and I can read a story from someone that's 10 paragraphs long about the second baseman of the New York Yankees. And that story hasn't existed for a very long time because that story, prior to paid subscriptions, the money wasn't there in the paid ads. The story would never get enough clicks. And then you also have this concept of like how much time it takes to put that story together, because a lot of these stories, I'm using sports as an example, there's a lot of nuance and a lot of detail. What's your wins above replacement as a baseball player over the past 20 years? Well, in the olden days, like I could flip through the indexes of sports information, and AI can now take this reporter that follows one sports team and say, hey, here's all the WAR statistics for all the players, and they can, without needing to be a coder, they can write something that says, I need you to tell me when any player on the New York Yankees is more than 10% above or below their standard deviation for wins above replacement. Boom, there's a story. Now,
That's it.
The AI can spit out that that Juan Soto is 10% above his WAR, but the author of that story is the one that's going to give it the color that I want to read. And
That's right.
And so now that author, instead of spending, and I'm making numbers up, instead of spending 6 hours researching and an hour writing, can now spend probably an hour or two researching and 3 or 4 hours writing. And that's
right.
the people that understand where there's money to be made, having informed opinions on things, can use AI to lever up in a very meaningful way.
I think that, from 2000 to now, the better you got at Google search, the better you got in terms of your ability to use advanced filters and stuff like that, the better you were able to find information quickly. And I don't know if people noticed that, but I certainly feel like I did. Like most things you need to know, particularly if it doesn't involve an opinion, are available somewhere on the internet. So as long as you knew how to do an advanced search on Google, you could find it. And I think where we're at kind of with AI now is kind of where Google was in the late 90s, early 2000s, where, we're still trying to figure out how to make the interface a little bit smoother for the average person. As you get older, there's some things that, everybody always like says, oh my gosh, everything's changed. But as you kind of like look back through your life, I feel like, it's kind of always the same thing that's happening, just with a slightly different tool. And I guess where I'm going with this is that one of the most formative blog posts for me that I had read like a decade or more ago was this one called 1,000 True Fans.
Okay.
And it way back, so if you Google 1,000 True Fans, you'll find the blog post. It's been updated recently and all that. And what it talks about, and this, you got to put this into context. This blog post came out like over a decade ago. And so what it talked about way back when was this idea that, it talked about this idea that the internet allowed you to niche down. And what he goes on to say essentially at that time was, he said, hey, look, if there's 1,000 people somewhere on the planet that really deeply care about the same stuff that you do, then your job is to talk about what you love talking about so much that you can find those 1,000 true fans. And if you can, that's probably worth $100K a year, however you want to do it, whether it's a paid newsletter, a SaaS product, whatever. I think he's updated it recently with this, with a very similar idea, but just kind of reinforce, like doubling down on this. And I guess where I'm going with this is that, for kids these days, and you and I were both kids, so we're probably not going to listen. We weren't going to listen if somebody told us this anyway. But I think it's, when you think about going to college, you go there for the life experience, you go there for the training. But you actually implicitly also go there, like the way you just described what she said. She said she wants to be a journalist, but that job may not exist. That's a subtle but really important kind of misunderstanding, because I went to school for electrical engineering and computer science.
Yeah.
What you and I do is nothing of that sort.
I went to culinary school. Yeah.
Right. Right. So the thing is though, is that, but that doesn't mean that college wasn't useful for me or for
Sure.
you, but it, through some combination of the classes you took, the experiences you had with your friends and the professors and the deans and whatever, you learn to think a certain way, and so, for example, I look at you as a very pragmatic, sort of rational thinker, and I can throw any problem or idea in front of your face, and I kind of know what lens you're going to look at it through, which is inherently different than the lens I look at it through, you know? And I think the thing for your kids and my kids is that, like, yeah, there's a bunch of stuff that is different, but I think what's different is the tools. But the way we have to teach them to think, that kind of remains the same. And the opportunity for them, I think, is different now, in the sense that, you know, like, you and I don't work in roles that have pensions, right? Like,
Right. Right.
my in-laws have pensions from the
Yeah.
shipyards,
Yeah.
and my
Yeah.
mom from the banks and stuff. But you and I have never had that.
No.
And our kids are not going to have that. About 10 years ago, I think I wrote a blog post on this. Back then, I thought that the highest paid people over the next decade were going to be designers and mathematicians. This is like 10 or 15 years ago. I wrote this like blog post of like, hey, if you're a designer, like, the internet is full of crappy looking websites. Designers that understand how to build businesses are going to do really well. And in terms of math, like, I just had this assumption that as data got bigger and bigger, you needed not only people that understood how to do SQL queries, but you needed, like, essentially somebody that had like a math brain
Yeah.
to kind of understand how to put it all together and what it meant and all that. And I think, as we go forward now, I think it's the people that can communicate the best are going to win. Because as these tools get better and stuff like that, the need for different viewpoints or well-articulated viewpoints is going to be more and more important, particularly for white-collar jobs. It's like, anyway, let me just pause there, because I could go on forever on this.
No, I think it's a good perspective, and I think I think ultimately, we keep coming back around to this point that, bottom line, neither one of us, I think, really believes that AI is a job killer. Will some people end up netting out of certain industries? Sure. Yeah, I mean, AI will replace some of those functions, but I think it's almost like an accelerator, in that those people were likely going to get competed out of that space by folks that are more knowledgeable or more hardworking at some point. AI just sort of accelerates the separating the wheat from the chaff.
AI is no more of a job killer than the MySQL database, than the pencil, than it's no different than any of those things. And, if somebody really wants to be a stickler and say, okay, well, something's different about it, I would say the pace at which it is developing is probably faster than anything else we've seen. That's because of the fact that, every technology compounds quickly. It's the compounding improvement that people don't understand, that has changed over time,
Right.
so, I think I'm an optimist, and I think that, like, the best part of this is that, in the long term, as long as people can communicate, whether it's with a human or with an AI prompt, your possibilities open up, like,
Right.
like, for example, you've kind of joked on me in terms of, like, with Beacon, I think a little bit of like, well, you're coding it or whatever. And I'm like, yeah, but the terrifying part to me as I think about this is not whether or not I can code, but the fact that somebody hungrier than me and you somewhere else in the world may not even need to know how to code
Right. Right.
if AI gets to a certain point,
Right. Right.
So
Yeah.
I think it's good. It's good,
All right, let's talk before we run out of time, because I don't think we're going to get to loop back on our Microsoft discussion. So I do want to save that one for next week if we don't have time. But I want to also talk about this tweet that you sent about OpenTable. And interestingly enough, essentially what OpenTable has decided to do in about a month is, as they're quoted, to build on the Sorry, for folks who don't know, OpenTable is a restaurant reservation app that allows you to book reservations for restaurants in a consolidated fashion. So you can just go to one place and they've got like a little bit of a loyalty program thing. They've got reviews in there. And so what they're doing now is to, as they say in quotes, to build on the credibility of our review program starting May 22nd, 2024. OpenTable will begin displaying diners' first names and profile photos on all diner reviews. This update will also apply to past reviews. Up until now, all of the reviews have been anonymous. I think what I said to you was, this seems like a shockingly bad decision.
Yeah. Well, okay, so you and I'm pretty sure. Well, I'll just speak for myself, and you disagree if you disagree. But I don't have any inside info. We only know what's public about this, right? But let's assume that they were kind of making a decision. They've thought it out well. They had their attorneys review it. I'm sure it passed all the legal checks and all that. But at face value, this just seems like a horrible, bad idea, and particularly because they didn't grandfather in the past. So the way that this is announced is that starting on a certain date, all reviews will have a profile photo, first name and last initial, even if the original comment that was made was anonymous.
Yeah.
Now, we could argue about like, hey, well, it's their business; they can do whatever they want. That's fair, but I don't know. It just feels kind of icky. Like if you may have had a perfectly reasonable reason for why you needed to make a comment anonymously, and there was a certain expectation of privacy, and now you probably don't even remember you wrote that thing, and now there's a chance that it could come back and blow up in your face. And
Yeah.
anyway, I guess where I'm going with this is that I don't know. I'm sure it passed legal review. I'm sure it passed like their business checks and all that, but it makes me kind of lose faith in this because there was a certain set of expectation of privacy, and now you've sort of ripped it away. I don't know. I would have grandfathered in everybody prior. I would have said, hey, no more anonymous reviews after this date. I'm curious. You've got the restaurant experience, so what's your take?
I mean, I think so. I think that businesses need to make sometimes bold and risky decisions to continue to grow over time. And OpenTable's been around for a long time, so I applaud them for thinking of a way to help add credibility to their reviews. And as a restaurant owner, I've had plenty of reviews and customer complaints that I know were not accurate, and I don't have a great way to combat that. So I think I do understand to some degree what they're trying to get at. I think that in this case where OpenTable's product, if you will, really is the customer. I know that we always talk about cases where like, B2C apps are sometimes the customer is actually the product. Here, OpenTable is selling to the restaurant access to their customer database to help book reservations for them. If customers are disenfranchised by this move, then OpenTable can't sell as many customers to the next restaurant. They provide less value. And OpenTable, for folks that don't know, typically provides some sort of an overlay in the restaurant to help manage those reservations. So a restaurant will either have OpenTable integrated into their existing point of presence, or they'll have a separate terminal that has all their tables on it and where reservations manage, all that stuff. So from a trust standpoint, as you talked about, the model's only valuable if OpenTable can continue to bring those customers. And if the customers lose faith in the process, well, I mean, that's a big risk for OpenTable to take. And I think in this situation, and it would mirror across a lot of different industries, not just food, I think it would have been a much more prudent decision to say, we at OpenTable have decided that it's important to identify the users to make sure that these are accurate reports. And going forward, we're going to disclose that information. And if they felt like the past reviews were important enough to stick around, then maybe you de-emphasize them in the scoring or something of that nature.
Right.
You adjust the algorithm for some period of time. But I don't think you can run over trust rails. And this is, I think, this is OpenTable and a discussion about restaurants, but change the industry and put your startup name on it. And anytime you're talking about involving consumers, I think trust is always at the top of the list. If it's not number one, it's number 1, 2, or 3 of the capital that you have in your product. And when you lose the trust of your users, especially when there's a low barrier to entry to go do something else, you risk losing a lion's share of your business.
I like to run, and I do a fair amount of races, not races, whatever, events, marathons, whatever, right? this week I got an email from a race. Gosh, I don't remember where it was, but anyway, there was a 10K race that emailed me. I have never done this race. I don't know these people. From what I can tell, it looks like an independent race organizer, in the Southeast, that I've never done any of their races. I got an email this week that they said, based on my previous race times, I had qualified for Wave B in one of their upcoming races. Now, I know this is getting a little nerdy, but just hear me out for a second.
Yeah.
When you sign up for a race, usually, like I would say, if you sign up for a race in the last 10 years, maybe even the last 15 years, more often than not, those race organizers use some sort of website and some sort of tool to track your time.
Yeah.
And, it used to be when I was in high school, just like your kids, right? You've got a daughter that runs, they used to probably put the times up for the races on a piece of paper on the wall, but now there's probably an app. There's probably a website, right?
Yeah.
So the point is, though, is that what they did was I actually clicked through to figure out what time they grabbed.
Yep.
And it's got minutes and seconds. So I was able to go back to my own race history and my Strava account, figure out what race it was.
Yep.
What it looks like they did, if I had to guess, they scraped a bunch of public race results websites, and they probably used some third party like Clearbit or something like that to tie together seemingly disparate data points to figure out that was my email. And then they cold emailed me. Okay. By the way, I did not sign up for this race, but now let's come back to this for a minute.
Yep.
I can't help but wonder. So putting aside the trust issue, which I agree with, I mean, like if I had an expectation of trust, you can tell me all day that, the terms and conditions told me that, my review is now the property of the company. You can tell me that all day, but
Right. I
still had a reasonable belief that, hey, even if you change the rules, you wouldn't retroactively change the trust we had last year. I wonder, so like in the healthcare world, there's this concept of PII, personally identifiable information. And there's a lot of legislation around that in the sense that you can't expose anything that could reasonably be used to tie data points back to figure out who that person was.
Right.
Like that's the general version of it, right? I can't help but wonder, like, if this, change with OpenTable could be like one of the beginnings of like maybe a broader discussion around PII in consumer internet. Because like, if you think about it, and I'd actually have to go back and look at my own OpenTable account because I'm sure I've used it and I'm sure I've done something right. But if they publish like my first name and my last initial and my avatar, which I don't know about you, like if you ever upload one of those, you probably use the same one everywhere. Well,
I'm
is
not
it
a big
possible?
Avatar guy, but yeah.
Yeah, but is it possible that somebody could now, scrape all that and tie it together with other data points that I might have had out there and start to build a picture around me? I don't know, but it's not outside the realm of possible. And so it sort of like begs this broader question of, will there ever be the equivalent of HIPAA in the consumer world? I don't know. Maybe.
I don't think so, because I do think to some degree the market polices itself. I think that the road of the past is littered with the carcasses of companies that made bad decisions with customer data. And so I think two things. One, I think the market corrects for these things. And two, I think while you and I are obsessed about this sort of customer data stuff, I do think that the majority of people are not. I mean, I've had numerous conversations with my wife about things that she publishes in terms of like, I'll use a very, very easy and obvious one. Happy birthday announcements for people on their birthday on social media. Okay, well, you now have one of my personally identifiable pieces of information based on that happy birthday, an announcement. And so, like you start adding that stuff up, and I do think, first off, like if it's a big enough egregious violation, I think the market takes care of itself. And second, I don't think as many people care about this as you and I do.
Maybe. You're probably okay. So I agree. You're probably right. We already know in one of our previous episodes, we talked about this idea that we already know that OpenAI is paying companies like Reddit for access to the data to train the models, right?
Yep.
Now, I don't know if you're on Reddit, but I'm on Reddit. And, with Reddit, there is a reasonable sense of privacy because you can have a username that's not tied to you and all that, right?
Sure. Right.
Okay, well, if you were scrolling through Reddit and you stumbled across one of my replies or my posts, you wouldn't actually know it was me unless you knew my Reddit username. Now we
Mhm.
already know that Reddit is selling that data to somebody else. Is it totally out of possibility here that, through some combination of deals and web scrapers that how do I say this? How do I say this? I may not know what your Reddit username is, but on the off chance I find an Ed Pizza or an Ed P that happens to have your screenshot or your headshot on OpenTable, and whether I scraped it or I paid OpenTable for that data, now I can probably figure out based on language with enough data points, I can figure out, yeah, God, that username on Reddit really writes like that guy Ed.
Yeah. Yep.
The possibilities start to get a little crazy because you're not wrong about the market policing these things, but we're also in this kind of new world where the market itself was kind of like, I don't know, like all these things were compartmentalized. So like if company A made a bad decision, the market around that company could probably, hopefully, revolt enough to kind of change that one company.
Yeah.
But we're in this kind of new world now where you have like Ed Pizza and your history exists across probably 100 sites that you've used on some regular basis over the last 10 years.
Yeah.
And you probably you probably don't think about your privacy too much because you're like, I'll just use a unique password and a different unique, username on each. Now you're pretty public, so it's not a big deal, right? Now it opens up this new can of worms of like, if there was one company or a handful of companies that were buying all that data, aggregating it all together and were able to tie you together, how
Yeah.
would it make you feel if I was able to say to my Chat GPT prompt, what, write this article in the voice of Ed Pizza? That's not out of the realm of possibility here.
No.
Um,
Right. And I don't think we're that far away from being able to
I,
do that in my voice, especially with how much written word there is
correct.
for me out there for sure.
And I'm not, just for the people listening, if you're still listening this far, I'm not against like progress. But what I'm suggesting here is that you, Ed Pizza, that's you. You own you.
Right.
And where it gets a little bit weird is we're in this new world now where you don't actually have the ability to own you. Like you don't have a say in whether or not your work, the things you contributed to Reddit or whatever, can go into that model. Like we've talked about this before, right?
Right.
That there's really no good legal precedent for how you uninclude yourself or your company's data from a
Sure.
training model.
Right.
Right. And I think that's going to be like one of the larger legal battles that we see over the next couple of years is that. And I don't know. Depending on what the political climate is around that time, I could see a future where, consumers maybe get more. I mean, this isn't out of the realm of possibility. This exists with HIPAA. This exists with, your
Yeah.
medical provider. You already have to sign away and say like, hey, I agree that, my data can be given for healthcare purposes or whatever, but it's not going to go anywhere else. So anyway, I could ramble about this for a while, but you remember when we were on the tech tour, we'd hear every once in a while, we'd hear somebody saying like, oh, we're doing something with big data. And we would historically just roll our eyes on that because most people end up with big data and have nothing. They're not going to actually do
Yeah.
anything with it. Right.
Yeah.
But now these companies that are creating these large language models kind of need that data. And if you have
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
large enough data set, like that big data that I'm not saying big data on its own is useful any more than useful it was, but now there's a buyer for it. And
Right.
now there's like, I don't know. Okay. Last thing on this topic, by the way, you and I, when companies that we invest in liquidate, historically, we don't buy any of the assets. We just sort of, I don't know about you, but like 99.9% of the time, we're like,
Yeah.
hey, just liquidate it. Hey, founder, just hang on to it, because it's not worth anything. What if that company ended up having it? Like, what if it liquidated, but it had like 3 terabytes of data that I don't know if it's useful?
Right.
Is it worth just paying $1,000 or, a couple $1,000 just to like, buy the rights to it and hold on to it for later? I don't know. It's kind
Oh,
of,
I do think in some cases, yeah, and I think that's existed before in different ways. I think it's even more so now with LLMs. But that is
Yep.
probably a good place to pin it because I know
Yeah.
you got to go. I do want to get back to this Microsoft thing, and
Oh,
not
yeah.
Microsoft specifically, but just this whole concept
Uh-huh.
of AI and king making and then the money that's going into it and how it's changing the ecosystem. So definitely pin that for next week. But I think that's where we end this week's journey, Mr. Singh.
I love it, man. I love it. Are you traveling at all this week?
Gosh, that should be an easy question to answer. Am I traveling between now and when we record again? No. Okay.
Whoa.
Yeah. No.
Whoa, what will you do? Oh my gosh.
I know. There's something kind of blissful about not getting on airplanes. I did spend a couple hours trying to book some stuff for our Japan trip this summer, and it was very, very involved. And I was on the phone with Delta like 6 or 7 times last night trying to get it all booked. Fresh in my mind, the intricacies of the travel world.
You're a better man than me. I'm like, I don't want to talk to anybody, but calling a company 6 or 7 times is not high on my list of exciting things to do.
Yeah, unfortunately, the airlines don't make it easy to do anything other than like a very basic, simple path. Click this button, pay with this credit card, and go. And if you want to do anything other than those things, and as you know me, my things involve upgrades and discounted gift cards and credits and this and that, and last night's involved all of those things. So it involved having a discussion with them about unaccompanied minors and all kinds of fun stuff.
Oh boy. Exciting. I love it, man. I love it.
All right. Well, I can't wait to talk next week more about this, this shift in the ecosystem being caused by, the big companies, the Microsofts and the Googles of the world, and how they're
and the
investing
money, the big money flowing around.
Yep, I got Post-it note right here for it. So
I love
week.
it. All right, man. Well, have a great week. I'll talk to you here soon.
All right, man. Take it easy.